In this week's Parshat Mishpatim, we read about the prohibition of cooking milk and meat together. But the Torah actually says, and of course everybody knows this, don't cook a kid in its mother's milk. The specific language used, and it's used in the Torah 3 times, it's the last of the commandments in this week's Parsha. Of course, our weekly reading has a lot of different commandments. And the last one, which is said in the context of the Jewish holidays, actually, when there are, I guess, a lot of animals, as Rashbam points out, and the goats in particular, a lot of times have 2 kids, and the owner might not want to preserve both, so he might slaughter one of them and cook it in its mother's milk. In particular, the tender meat of a goat would work really well if you cook it in the milk, as opposed to a piece of meat from an older animal, a piece of beef from an old cow. It's not gonna really taste well if you cook it in milk. But the tender meat of a newborn goat, newborn kid, will taste quite well if you cook it in milk. And the Torah specifically says don't do it. And of course our sages understand this to be rather an example. It's not that any other milk is permitted to be cooked with the meat. Rather, it's an example. Don't cook the kid in its mother's milk, and how much more so other types of milk and meat. The truth is, all of this is not so obvious. Let me explain. First of all, the very well-known drash that Rashi brings, and pretty much every Orthodox Jew probably knows, that the reason the Torah says 3 times, don't cook a goat in its mother's milk, a kid in its mother's milk, it's to include, by repeating it 3 times, the Torah includes 3 different prohibitions. First of all, you're not allowed to cook. Secondly, you're not allowed to have enjoyment, any benefit from the meat that's cooked with milk. And also, of course, you're not allowed to eat meat and milk cooked together. Notice, only if they're cooked together. Making a sandwich with some, let's say, a hot dog together with a piece of cheese would not be forbidden from the Torah. It's forbidden rabbinically, but it's not forbidden from the Torah. The Torah only forbids if milk and meat are cooked together, each one gets the taste of each other. That's the biblical prohibition according to Chazal. The example is the kid in his mother's milk, but it includes any kind of meat and milk that's cooked together. But it does not include eating them together when they're not cooked together. And certainly it does not include eating milk immediately after meat. All of these are rabbinical prohibitions, and in some cases it's not even clear if it's a rabbinical prohibition. There's actually a dispute of Rishonim if one is allowed to eat milchik products after meat, if one washes his hands well and his mouth and eats something in between, like a piece of bread. There are some Rishonim that say you could eat immediately milk after meat if you do the specific procedures to clean up the teeth and things like that and the hands. But the majority of Jews wait 6 hours, or a pretty long time at any rate, between fleshik and milchik products. But all of this is at most, as I said, rabbinical law. The biblical law, according to Chazal, is when the milk is cooked together with meat, that's when it's biblically prohibited to eat it, or to enjoy it, to derive any enjoyment. So first of all, one should know that there are opinions in Chazal, mentioned in various places in the Gemara, that there is no prohibition of enjoyment altogether. We don't follow that opinion, but that opinion exists. So if meat and milk are cooked together, according to some opinions, you'd be allowed to sell it or to derive other enjoyment, maybe feed it to an animal. You cannot sell it to another Jew because you cannot help other Jews commit avirot, do something that's sinful, but you could sell it to a non-Jew. We don't follow those opinions, and as I said, if milk and meat are cooked together, we have to destroy the product, bury it or flush it down the toilet, whatever it is, throw it out, but you're not allowed to derive any enjoyment from meat and milk cooked together. But like I said, there's a dispute about it among the sages of the Talmud, of the Mishnah. So that's number one. That already puts into question, right, raises a question about this whole drash about 3 times repetition, because not everybody even agrees that there is a prohibition. I'm not even talking about the actual drash, the proof of that prohibition. The prohibition itself doesn't exist according to everybody. It exists according to some opinions, but not others. On top of it, if you look, for instance, in the Mechilta, the main halachic midrash to our parsha, there are a lot of other drashot there about the 3-time repetition of the same prohibition. This prohibition, don't cook your kid in his mother's milk, that's repeated 3 times. There are a number of other interpretations, completely different, that don't talk about cooking or enjoying or eating, but rather all kinds of other ideas. For example, one possibility is that it's to include 3 types of domestic animals. That biblically, it's only domestic animals that are forbidden to be cooked with milk. That's how the Shulchan Aruch seems to be paskening, right? That's the opinion of the majority of scholars, that only if it's a cow or a goat or a sheep, when they're cooked in the milk, that's when it's forbidden from the Torah. But if you take deer, for instance, or other animals that are kosher, or you take the milk from other animals that are kosher but are not domestic animals, there's only 3 kosher domestic animals. So if you take, for instance, deer's milk and cook it with deer meat or with regular beef, all of that is only rabbinically prohibited according to the way we paskin halacha. So according to one of the midrashim, the fact that the 3 particular animals you cannot cook biblically in milk, those 3 are included or rather hinted to by the fact that it's a 3-time repetition of the same prohibition. Don't cook kid in its mother's milk, to include goats, sheep, and beef, cows. That's the 3. There are other opinions too. I'm not going to go into this right now. I'm just trying to say that this drash that we include the prohibition of enjoyment and the prohibition of eating and cooking, that's the 3-time repetition. It's only according to one opinion, but there are other opinions as well. On top of it, interesting are the words of Ibn Ezra that seems to suggest that the reason it's forbidden to cook milk and meat together is because we're afraid that maybe it will be in its mother's milk. It's only one of the possibilities he offers, but at least according to this, one might say, or would be at least tempted to say, that maybe there was an opinion that biblically it's really just the mother's milk with a kid that's forbidden. But because a lot of times people buy milk in the market, especially in the smaller towns where a lot of times it's the same animals, the same cows and their kids, or the same goats and their kids that are being sold. And a lot of times they would be selling milk on the market and they'll be selling a goat, and you might not know that you'll be cooking, once you allow the cooking of regular meat with regular milk, you might end up cooking actually a kid in its mother's milk. So if that's the case, it could very well be that the Torah actually only forbids when it's the milk of the mother. But the rabbis understood that once you allow any kind of cooking of milk and meat together, people will sometimes break the law of the Torah as well. Now, it doesn't seem that Ibn Ezra concludes that way, but at least this possibility is offered. Now, there's an interesting idea that there was a sage that lived in Egypt. He was almost unknown to our people for longest period of time. Strangely enough, it's the Christian church that used to quote certain things from him. But he wrote in Greek, and of course the Jewish people generally didn't know Greek. And practically, right, the 2 main languages that were used by our sages for a long period of time were Hebrew and Aramaic. So anything that was written in other languages for a while was forgotten. Maybe he had some more influence in the ancient times, but he lived about 2,000 years ago, slightly more than that. So his name was Philo from Alexandria, the city in Egypt. I guess the Jewish way to call him, if you say Philo, is for instance, the word philosoph means the one who loves wisdom, right? Sophia is wisdom in Greek. Philo is to love. Maybe some people heard the term philosemite. It's the opposite of anti-Semite. And anti-Semitism is anti-Jews, so philo-Semitism is the opposite, people who love Jews. So philo means to love. So therefore they started translating his name into Hebrew as Yedidia, right? From the word Yadid, love, beloved, was by the way one of the names of Shlomo HaMelech. So Yedidia Alexandria, that's how the term for the sage in the last hundreds of years, when the Jewish people rediscovered him in a certain sense. Again, he's not really quoted that much in Jewish literature. But Rabbi Kaplan, for instance, Rav Aryeh Kaplan in his commentary to Torah sometimes quotes him. So sometimes in Hebrew they call him Yedidia ha-Alexandri, Yedidia from Alexandria. So this Philo from Alexandria seems to suggest that in fact that the prohibition davka applies to the milk that's cooked with a kid of that animal. So it's apparently something similar to the suggestion of Ibn Ezra that maybe the biblical law only applies in this way. Now, again, we don't find anywhere in Chazal such a suggestion that the reason milk and meat are forbidden to be cooked together is only because of the possibility that you'll cook in its mother's milk. All the sages agree that at least some animals with some milk are forbidden from the Torah. The only question is which ones. As I said, we follow the halacha that it applies only to domestic animals and only to the milk from domestic animals. But at least it does apply to all the domestic animals and not necessarily to the mother's milk. But anything that is suggested by various sages in the times of after the Talmud, or even in this case of Yedidia Alexandri, he was actually before the Talmud, it's not an impossibility that such an opinion existed among the sages of the Mishnah and the Talmud as well. Not every opinion, of course, came to us. We know there are cases when a certain opinion seems like everybody agrees on it, and then we find some midrash that follows a different opinion. A lot of times this midrash may be uncovered later, or it's not a particularly well-studied midrash. I'll give you an interesting example on the Week's Parsha as well. When it talks about the Hebrew slave, it says that he has to work 6 years and goes free in the seventh. He's only a servant. I don't want to call it even slavery. It's not really slavery. It's more like a servant who cannot quit for 6 years. It's a contract of 6 years. It's talking about a person who stole and did not repay what he stole when he was found. It turned out that he doesn't have any more what to pay with. So he works for 6 years to compensate. Right? In other countries, he'd be put to jail. We don't have jail sentences in Judaism. There was no such thing. The only thing that's closest to maybe a jail sentence is, also in this week's Parsha, it's mentioned a person who eventually killed somebody. He runs away to a city and lives there until the high priest dies. So that's a kind of big jail. You cannot leave that city. He's not sitting in one cell, he's sitting in one city for a period of time, maybe for years, until the Kohen Gadol dies. So that's the closest to the idea of jail. So at any rate, the thief, instead of being put to jail, he works for 6 years for someone to compensate. So the 6 years are counted, as Rashi brings in the name of the Talmud, from the point of his being sold, not according to the Shemitah cycle, meaning it has nothing to do with the 7th year, the Shemitah cycle. Rather, it's 6 years from the point of being sold until he goes out on his 7th year. However, Bechor Shor, one of the early commentators from Balei Tosafot, says that it's actually the 7th year is the Shemitah, is the year of Shemitah, the 7th year when the land rests. That's when the slaves go out. And in fact, it seems from Targum Yonatan, so-called, that he also apparently held that way. So we find that sometimes something seems to be a clear halacha in the Talmud and in Rashi, and still there are opinions that differ. So could be, I think, at least it's not an impossibility, that there existed among sages some opinions that were rejected and that did not become normative halacha, and that is that the biblically prohibited case is only when milk and meat are from the same animal. It's the kid of the mother, basically. It's the milk. Of course, it would apply to a cow as well. There's no reason why it wouldn't apply to a cow any less than to a goat or to a sheep. But at any rate, only biblically, possibly when it's the same animal. But there were possibilities that the Torah is just giving an example, and it includes other animals and other milk as well. And as I said, that's how we paskin, and that's the only opinion in Chazal that we have in our hands today. Nowhere, as far as I know, neither in the Talmud nor in Midrashim is this even offered as a possibility that the biblical prohibition only applies to the mother's milk. What's interesting is that the Targum Onkelos, the translation to Aramaic, the standard translation, already uses the term. It was done particularly that the people who didn't know Hebrew would listen to the Aramaic translation. And there the normative halacha is said as a clear thing. Don't eat milk with meat together. That's how he translates this verse. Whatever the case may be, in my particular opinion, that there is no major difference between what's biblical and what's not. There's very rare, only in very specific circumstances, when there are cases when the Rabbanan and rabbinical law makes a difference for us in terms of some leniencies. But in practice, so much of prohibitions that have to do with milk and meat are rabbinical, as I just mentioned. The fact that we don't eat them together even when they weren't cooked together, the fact that we actually wait between the two, even certain harchakas, certain stringencies that have to do with two people eating at the same table if they know each other, one eating milk, one eating meat. We're afraid that somebody might, eating on the same kind of placemate, milk and meat. All these things are extra harchakot, making a person stay far away from the biblical prohibition. So you might say, why is it that the sages made so many rabbinical laws surrounding this one law, even if we say that biblically any meat with any milk cannot be cooked and eaten together? But why make so many prohibitions on top of it? Okay, so the rabbis could have forbidden, for instance, the milk and meat to be eaten together even when they weren't cooked together, but why forbid eating them one after another? Why do you have to wait? All this seems to be like an extra precaution, way too far. Usually the rabbis don't do that. It's very rare that the rabbis would put so many gezerot, so many rabbinical prohibitions against the biblical prohibition. The answer is that not all rabbinical prohibitions are just a gather, just a fence around the biblical prohibition. One might be tempted to say that all the rabbis did is make sure that we'll never break the biblical law. That's not necessarily true. A lot of times they saw the intent of the biblical law, especially based on teachings of Kabbalah, for instance, and other reasons, and extended it on rabbinical level. We know it's rabbinical, that's why it's not considered adding to the Torah. It's not forbidden when it's on rabbinical level that they made their prohibitions. And when they saw the intent of the Torah to separate the meat and the milk completely, so they kept adding and adding, because this is really the shoresh, the root of the underlying cause for all of this is that meat has to do with killing. You cannot have meat without killing an animal. Milk, the opposite. It's the greatest chesed, it's the greatest kindness that the mother gives milk to the kid. And the poor kid that has nothing and it has just the mercy of its mother that feeds it, breastfeeds it, and that's how the kid survives. So it's two real opposites. Milk and meat are really opposites of each other in a certain sense. Meat has to do with gvura, with the left side of hanhaga, what the Mikubalim call, and milk, it's white collar also. The colors also have to do with it. The white collar has to do with kindness, with the mercy. So the two cannot be mixed at all. The Torah gives us one example, kid in his mother's milk, the greatest achzariyut, terrible cruelty. But on top of it, the rabbis understood that generally milk and meat shouldn't be mixed together altogether in all cases, and even if they're not cooked together. And that's why it seems that the rabbis were specifically very strict with all kinds of rabbinical laws on top of this specific prohibition. And on this I'll end for today. If you like this video, please press like. If you don't like it, you could press that you don't like it. And if you want, you could subscribe to our channel.